This week in Pure Reinvention.
As soon as you get done reinventing the product, if you don't keep on reinventing, you're going to become complacent and you're going to fall behind again.
Episode 50, Erik Larson, Executive Director, Impression 5 Science Center.
Engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Welcome to this edition of the Pure Reinvention podcast, where our mission is to create space for the unexpected by inspiring a reinvention lifestyle. Hi, Misty.
Hi, Mike. We are at 50 episodes.
Isn't that awesome?
It's really cool.
That's a one a week for almost a year, and we are really building some really strong momentum around this Pure Reinvention concept. Misty, we sometimes wonder if we're going to run out of really great interviews, and here's another one.
Right. It's amazing because really once you start looking and paying attention, there are so many people. They have very different stories to tell, but they all have a story about how they're trying to make sustainable change happen.
I've been fortunate to be a board member of the Impression 5 Science Center for a number of years, and the journey that this business has gone through, quite honestly, is nothing short of phenomenal. I don't know, Misty, if we can truly capture all of the different lessons that Impression 5 has taught us in the reinvention process, but there are many.
Well, we can start with Erik, and he has learned on a personal level and on a business level a lot of lessons.
The executive plays such a key role in the reinvention process, and Erik will talk about, in this interview, about his own role and how in his role, how he had to learn to move from using up his entire bandwidth of thought on survival to beginning to create space and to give an opportunity for growth to creep in. And quite honestly, for all of us who have been in a survival mode at one time or another, believe me, it's really hard to think there's anything but survival when all you're worried about is getting by.
Yeah, listen for some takeaways of Erik, how he's willing to change and be adaptable, and how he's learned across the board. It's not just that he's learned from his board of directors or from the business model or from the STEM, the science industry. He's let everything be his teacher.
He has. Erik is that type of executive who is a sponge and who was ready to go on that journey of reinvention. There were some other pieces that need to fall into place that Erik will talk about, the role of the board of directors, the role of the industry in general. But above all, you needed to have that one person internally who was ready to own that next phase. And once you can identify and make that the next trigger point, as Erik was able to do, then I think what you see in the next phase will absolutely be astonishing.
So let's listen to Erik tell his story about how he went from a survival mindset to a growth mindset.
What an exciting interview we have today with Erik Larson, who is the Executive Director of Impression 5 Science Center. Welcome, Erik, to this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Erik, I-5 is an incredible gem for not only the city of Lansing, but regionally as well. Wouldn't you agree?
Totally.
Tell us a little bit about kind of the background at I-5 and why it is such an incredible gem.
Well, I think what makes Impression 5 so valuable to the community is that it was built from the community for the community. Initially launched in the early 70s in 1972 as a response to one woman's vision for creating meaningful, hands-on, or interactive science education for kids. And at that period of time, formal education was really struggling with science, and she felt there was a massive opportunity to engage kids in exploring science in a much more meaningful way. And I think that being the foundation of Impression 5 has really led to the reinvention, as we're going to talk about today, almost the evolution of science education in our community and beyond, and of course the role that a public science center plays in that.
So the Public Science Center plays a huge role in this really important young children demographic. But the journey for I-5 hasn't always been easy, has it?
Absolutely not.
And so as you kind of reflect on what the journey has been like, why is it important for every business, but Impression 5 in particular, to really think about how its continuous ability to reinvent itself is so important?
What we struggled with over the history of Impression 5 was a little bit of complacency. We got good at what we did and we saw some good trends, and then you kind of relax, and all of a sudden you lose your relevancy and you go into panic mode. And I think that, through our exploration of what's happened in Impression 5 over those 4 decades, you can absolutely pinpoint periods of time in which that was happening to the Science Center. We think that we need to change the model that a nonprofit science center uses in order to be successful, through the way that it is managed, both internally with its staff, the way that it engages its board and its community support, and then, of course, the way that it stays on the cutting edge, or is as knowledgeable as it can in the trends that are specific to what it's trying to serve in the community. And so through that, you had to ask a lot of tough questions, and we had to be blatantly honest with ourselves. And that has really led to, I think, a great deal of momentum, a great deal of clarity in where we want to go as an organization and what we think we can achieve if we follow that path. But it has not been easy. It's been incredibly difficult, both as an organization and as a staff. But from the leadership standpoint, it's been a complete change in the way that I have to think, and the way that I motivate my team, and the way that I design measurables to make sure we're moving forward.
Can you expand on what that means to do business differently when you're talking about more than just product lineup?
Really, when I look at Impression 5 specifically and what we have been through, I'll tell you, it was probably easier to reinvent the product than it was to even begin to talk about reinventing the way the business was managed, because we had gotten into a point where things were comfortable, and we were comfortable being in survival mode. And you and I have talked about this a lot. Mm-hmm. You're just making payroll, you're just getting ready for your next quarterly financial goals, instead of really planning where you want to be in 3 to 5 years, what type of sustainability plan are we going to build, what's our real pathway for growth. So the easy part, and it's kind of hard to even say that because it was not easy, but the easy part was for us to look at our exhibits, our educational programs, and our facility, and use a SWOT analysis to determine what our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and immediately start tackling those, because those are things that you can almost have instant gratification with. But the more challenging piece was to rethink the way that we managed the business, both from an internal staff perspective and from a board's perspective. And so from an internal staff perspective, it really boiled down to, do we have the right people in place to move the organization forward? If so, great. How do we create resources so we can retain them and train them and I guess increase our productivity, if you will, and our results? And if we don't have the right people in the place, how do we identify what those needs are so we can have the right team in place to move this new product forward? Because as soon as you get done reinventing the product, if you don't keep on reinventing, you're going to become complacent and you're going to fall behind again. And that's where we are right now.
And it's interesting because you started with the people. I mean, you started with the product, and of course that became kind of a natural flow for you to think about how you in your product cycle of exhibits, you change those. But focusing on people first is intriguing for me, because that you immediately went there. You must see that people are what are driving the reinvention process for you.
I think that the largest and most valuable asset that Impression 5 currently has, if you will, or exists within Impression 5, is its human capital. We are in a business in which we need to design and fabricate and deliver things, and those are only done by passionate, motivated individuals, humans, that can make that happen. And we've got people on both sides of the equation. Because our product is driven or funded by people paying admission to come across the threshold of a facility filled with cool science exhibits, we have to think about that group as our target audience. But then we also have to think about the group of us, the 30 of us at this point, that work behind the scenes to make sure that that experience is fantastic. And so you absolutely have to start with people, because that's what's going to get it done, who's going to get it done, and that's where you have to ask the really tough questions. And Mike, you and I have talked about this a lot. It was very hard for me to do in the beginning.
You're talking about the people internally to the business, mm-hmm. But I'm going to guess that you're going to tell me that there's some people that are important external to the business as well.
I would put those in kind of two different separate categories. Let's say external human influences, if you will. We have, of course, our visitors, which have been monumentally important in reinventing their science center, because while they don't necessarily own it and we're not funded through any of their tax dollars, essentially, they are our customers.
Sure.
And if we don't have a product that they want, they're not going to come and yet so forth. So what we need to make sure is we have an open dialogue with that group. And so what we've done is create focus groups, lots of opportunity for dialogue in both directions to make sure that their science center becomes the best science center in the state of Michigan and what they want to see in their town. Now, I would take a separate category of human influence, if you will, and I would say that really is our board of directors and our community partners, meaning the people that are really from a high kind of 20,000-foot airplane view, if you will, looking at the strategic development of the organization and where we're going to be in 5 to 10 years, not where we're going to be next December. In this process of reinvention, it has been monumentally important that the board of directors of Impression 5 has played a very meaningful role in this reinvention, and specifically a small group of that board being almost tactically involved in pushing me as the executive director and the overall leadership of the organization to rethink everything, to rethink where we are in the marketplace, to rethink how we train and retain our talent, and to think about how we reinvent our product. And that's been an incredible process for us. I think that's been a very important process. I think that there is definitely a number of things we could have achieved as a team inside Impression 5 without the support of our board, but I think we would be fractured in our approach, and I think we would ultimately not be as successful as we wanted to be without creating those advocates within the board of directors and surrounding the leadership of Impression 5 with true experts in their field. And I say that meaning that a board of directors for a nonprofit, at least in my stance or here at the Science Center, has to be a board of people that wants to get involved, and they have to be an expert in some genre of the industry. So, for example, I have a brain trust that I meet with every month, sometimes more than a month. And that brain trust includes a gentleman who has been a manager of many nonprofits and understands the nonprofit world. A gentleman, Mike Bills, who obviously understands business consulting and strategic planning for organizations and businesses. And then another gentleman who literally runs a tech company here in town. And so what that has done is it's created these three minds that are willing to tell me honestly what they think, hold me accountable for performance that I need to achieve, and they give me a confidential sounding board that I can share ideas with, that I can ask very honest questions with, and I know that I'll get honest feedback, and that'll help me shape the next steps that we take through, whether it be strategic planning or product redevelopment or retention, whatever it may be.
Because that's that continuous journey that you talk about. So it sounds like one of the opportunities or barriers that the executive has to work through is their own understanding of their own role and how they don't go singular, but they indeed start to broaden their scope of a team outside of their current staff to help enhance their own experiences.
Yeah, I think that it really is a good connection point. And as you're asking that question, I'm thinking about what has changed in the way that how I behave and how I perform in this organization over the last, let's say, 20 years. And I think about what's different about my behavior and my approach to work today than it was even 10 years ago or 3 years ago. And I think what the massive change has been is that for so long we had been so closely mired in survival mode that the way that I could be successful is just to simply grind it out, is to work harder than anybody, is to be here to sweep the floors, empty the trash, count the cash registers, and be the last one here to make sure the lights get shut off. And we did that for a long time. And that was what we did to survive. And we survived through that. But I think what's been the biggest change or reinvention of me as Erik Larson, if you will, has been the understanding that in order for this business to grow, I can't be tactically involved in deciding where the water cooler goes or sweeping the floors or counting the cash registers. What I have to be strategically involved in is where we are in 3 years, where we are in 5 years, and making sure that I have the team in place to make us get there. And that's a monumental shift in the way you think.
spend a minute and talk about how the continuity of leadership that has been a change that you have initiated has enhanced your ability to work through some of these things that you're describing.
Yeah, I think that continuity and what currently exists with the leadership, specifically with the board of directors of Impression 5, and then, of course, the longevity that the leadership internally has had, has been a major factor in our recent success. And I think what happens with that, or what I feel happens with that, is that, for example, our chair, our board chair, I think now is serving maybe his second and a half term of leadership, and that also extends down the line with our full executive committee, yourself included, our treasurer, those folks who have all decided that instead of serving a term and rotating off, that they wanted to be a part of something that was truly special. And not that serving one term isn't, but when we're talking about essentially starting a new business, I mean, that's really what we're doing. We had the fortunate ability to do that from an existing business, so it's easier than probably bootstrapping it, but we're essentially starting a new business. When you have, I guess, the trust on both sides of the table, I trust my board, I specifically trust my executive committee, I have a feeling of trust and support from them as well. I think it gives us a better ground to take risks together, to make sure that we can grow the organization. And I think if you're constantly recruiting who your next board chair is going to be, or who your next vice chair is going to be, then you get lost in that cycle. And probably for lack of a better comparison, I kind of look at the term limits we have in political cycle, or even what we're coming into now with with electing a new president of the United States. There's so many months, potentially even years, that are simply spent campaigning for those pieces, which makes it really tough for tough work to get done. And I think if I had to spend 2 months out of every year trying to identify who is going to volunteer their time to become the next chair of the board of directors of Impression 5, we would never be on the same clip that we're on today. And so I really think that continuity, that commitment to something that's longer than a year, maybe 3 years. I think Noah's now on maybe 6 years, yourself included in that mix. I think that's been really helpful. And while you don't want that to go on in perpetuity, you definitely need that chunk of time, specifically with a massive investment like we're trying to do here at the Science Center, to make sure that all the players are still in touch through that and the leadership.
Stabilizing influence.
And we'll probably get to the point where the reinvention process through the redevelopment of our facility and the 100% reinvention of the exhibit inventory and so forth probably gets to the point where we need to identify the next team that has the motivation to push it even further. And we'll get through that challenge as well. And I think there'll be people that'll be eager to get involved in it. But I think what we've created over the last 4 or 5 years, maybe even beyond that, is an organization that people want to be involved in.
And all of those things, Eric, that you have been doing in specifically the last 3 to 5 years, which has really had a major impact on the presence of Impression 5, other science centers have now noticed. And other science centers and other not-for-profits are coming to you and asking for your advice on why you're doing what you're doing and how are you getting the new results that you're getting when they're not. Is that true?
It is true.
And what is your advice to them when they say to you, what are these major things that you are doing that we need to consider in our own business that will help us to get into a reinvented place like what the Impression 5 Science Center has done?
First step is having an honest conversation with your target audience. You need to define who you're trying to reach, why you're trying to reach them, and where you're going to reach them. And once you identify those folks, you need to have an honest conversation with them about what they want. Specifically in our scenario, we're a hands-on interactive science center. So we're talking about why would you choose to take your family to Impression 5 on Saturday as opposed to go to the mall or go to a water park? Where's our competitive advantage? And if you don't have that honest dialogue with your end user, then you're in trouble. And so that's my first piece of advice. You have to start there.
Engage your customers.
Engage your customers. And I think what that does, if you're paying attention and listening and actually willing to hear really critical feedback, you can then start to build, if you will, a pathway to reinvention. Ours started with big Post-it papers on the walls and the SWOT analysis that included the 3 pieces of our product. And when we boiled all that down, we realized that Impression 5, who had been serving essentially 4th graders for 20 years and only 4th graders for 20 years, had identified a target audience that was limiting. We only have 4th graders. All right, so how are we going to grow that? Well, there's only so many 4th graders in the state of Michigan. Vice versa, you can go all the way through that. But our real growth strategy is to build a product that would be attractive to families. Families that have infants and toddlers and 5-year-olds and 12-year-olds and whomever may come with them. So if we build a product that actually engages that group, now we have a massive market that we can sell our product to, if you will. And we can start to think about, are we a great science center just for Lansing, or are we a great science center for mid-Michigan, or are we a great science center for the Midwest?
Right, that regional thought process is very exciting, isn't it?
It's phenomenal. It's changed the way we think about everything.
So once we get past the engagement, customer engagement, what comes after customer engagement?
Well, I really think that after that customer engagement will define, I think, what you need to do. In our case, it did. I mean, people were very honest. We want this, we want this, we want this. And through that, we boiled that down and we created vision. And you have to articulate this. You have to get this to the point where you can speak it, and not just a mission statement on a wall or, in a brochure, but what are you actually trying to create? And for us, it was what we refer to as Play, Create, Challenge. Through that process, we decided that everything that we do at Impression 5 is going to be focused on creating a space for families to play with science together, to create new ideas using science together, and to challenge their understanding of science together. And you'll notice that I said together 3 times, because through the process, we also identified that the family unit is probably the most dynamic learning unit ever created. And if we can build exhibits and educational programs that encourage a multi-generational group, a family who already has trust, who already take risks together, and already want to spend time together, then we're creating a truly unique experience inside Impression 5, one that not many science centers are creating. And so if we have that, we have a competitive advantage to be the best in our market to serve our target audience. So once we identified that, which was a monumental task, we literally walked around the building. We walked around and looked at our exhibits. We evaluated every educational program and said, does that fit Play, Create, Challenge? And if it doesn't, let's get rid of it. If it sort of does, how do we tweak it? And we started that process 7 years ago with rebuilding everything to fit the vision of Play, Create, Challenge.
So you really let it all go. I mean, you really said we had to completely let go of whatever our old was to start the new. You talked about that the same with yourself. You had to let go of whatever the old pattern was and be open to the new, and you actually said the same thing with your relationship with the board of directors, that you had to kind of look at how all of that had to be new. So I guess your advice to a new executive is to say you have to get comfortable letting go of the old and being open to the new.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest struggle as an individual and as a leader was admitting that I needed to change the way I lead, and I needed to step back from the habitual behaviors that I was performing within, if you will, and I needed to understand that not everything that I was going to do was going to work, and I had to not be afraid of failing. And I know a lot of people say that, specifically now with all the buzz that's wrapped around entrepreneurial interest all over the state and all over the world. Can't be afraid to fail. Well, okay, that's easier said than done.
Exactly.
And in a space where you're at the helm of a business that's been in existence for 40 years, I was so scared of failure. Not because of me and where I would end up, but I don't want to be the guy that runs Impression 5 into the ground. This is a place that was started as somebody's passion. Mm-hmm. This is bigger than just that. And so, I've got the name of the biggest sponsors in the state of Michigan on the walls of our science center. If this fails, I've failed them. So there's a lot of pressure within that. But I understood that I could not get better if I didn't step back and really evaluate who I was and how I can lead. And what helped me with that was having outside trusted mentors. I had mentioned the brain trust before, but that group of 3 individuals was so helpful in helping me identify the changes in the behavior I needed to make in order to change the way I led. And if I had to try and do that on my own, I probably would not have been able to do it.
Erik, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
What a cool story about surviving or moving from surviving to growing.
There's so many things in this interview, Misty, that people can pull out of it, from the role of the board to the role of the executive to the role of the business to the role of key board members. That it's almost a question of where do we start.
Let's dive into Erik teaching himself how to let go.
Well, by Erik's own admission, he was raised in the business. And so for many executives who have spent a considerable amount of their time in the business, doing what you've always done becomes second nature. And if you spend 100+% of your time just doing what you've always done and not leaving any space to do anything different, as was the case with Erik, you get the same thing. And the business had gone through a very lengthy survival process, as I think a lot of not-for-profits do, especially in that science center arena. Many of them are kind of just getting by. And yet, when you think about what the attraction is, and you think about moms and kids and science and the importance of that, this should be a home run. And so as Erik began to learn how to take a step back and see the greater potential, a lot of other cool things started to come along.
He wasn't kidding when he said that, we needed to look at the business model and really reinvent it and redevelop it. That's stripping it all away and asking those questions. Our audience can't be fourth graders forever.
That to me was the expansion of thought that began the journey, which was it wasn't going to be such a small silo of customers, but the Science Center was engaging a whole age demographic of which included families and grandparents, as well as younger children. And by expanding the thought process on what customers were interested in your business, I think the business began to realize that there were other things that could be expanded that also would have kind of a dramatic new effect. And then you start some things cascading, which is a really cool phenomenon.
So here we have, with this conversation, the benefit of Erik's hindsight. So he's made it over that hump and he's learned how to let go and look at things from a very new and very strategic way. But I bet if we talked to him a year ago, we would have heard a much different story.
I think that's actually right, Misty, that I think the tendency is to resist the change in thinking you're protecting the business because the business needs for you to be doing these things. And I think even in the interview, Erik talks about, I needed to think about opening the doors to the business the next day.
Yes. And then he moved to, what am I doing tomorrow or in a month to boost those relationships?
Yes.
And build
when you
that.
start to not look right down at your feet, but begin to make your gaze kind of up onto the horizon, Erik began to think about, okay, how do I start the timing of the exhibits, and when are the exhibits too old, and how do I bring in traveling exhibits, and how do I bring in big ones and small ones, and all these things. It became a whole different way in which the executive starts to focus their attention. And so it is a very, very big shift.
And I think another way that helped him have the space to do that was the trust he had built with his board that gave him some very clear directives.
Parallel to that journey that the executive was going through, the board was going through its own journey. And the board was beginning to identify within itself that there were different roles that people should be playing. And I'm going to give credit to the current president right now, Noah Smith, for having the foresight to be able to start looking at each board member and seeing their area of expertise and beginning to leverage that experience and that expertise to the benefit of the business. And that's really where it began to start, was the executive ready to make some changes, coupled with not a leader that was changing on an annual basis, but a leader that we had decided we needed to have some constant continuity of leadership. So now Noah had been in his position as a president for a couple of years. And now we started to get the synergy of these two individuals and the change process about to take place.
I think we could spend a lot of time talking about that whole trust aspect of getting that core team together where you knew you were going on this journey together. You had the support. Erik talks about his brain trust. So that must be a couple of key people. I think he said 3 other people, and I know you're included on that.
It is, Erik got to the point, and this is a key with executives, when executives get to the point where they know they need to go into this next dimension, but because their experience is not there, it's very important that that executive have the confidence of their board in moving into this new dimension. And in this particular example, Erik was able to identify some individuals who had the experience background that he needed in this reinvention space, and started meeting with them on a regular basis. And what that begins to do is it begins to build the confidence of the executive that this new direction is important, and it begins to build in the board that the support of these new initiatives that are coming from the business are so important. I can't say this any stronger, Misty. The change process to be sustainable has to be within the business. Mm-hmm. The board can support, but the change has to be initiated from inside the business.
It takes ownership, which is another one of our fundamentals, and it comes right after step 1, which is a disruption. It's time to own. And in the peer reinvention lesson in that is that you have to start it from the beginning. You have to start that ownership at the ground level.
Remember, if you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts. Make it peer reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.